One day after school, Mrs. Huggins asked Henry to run down to the market for a pound of ground round steak. On the way home, he decided to cut through the vacant lot to see if he could find a Coke bottle to turn in at the supermarket for pennies to add to his bike fund. He was careful to keep the meat out of Ribsy's reach. While Henry was looking for bottles, Ribsy, barking excitedly, bounded off into the bushes. Because it was so unusual for his dog to leave a package of meat, Henry followed to see what he was chasing. It was only a neighborhood cat, but when Henry started back to the path, he noticed a piece of gray cardboard with printing on it sticking out of the bushes. He stopped to see what it was. "Wow!" exclaimed Henry. Thrown carelessly in a hollow and half hidden by weeds was a pile of boxes. On the end of each box was printed the words "Double Bubble Gum." Telling himself the boxes were probably empty, Henry hastily hid the meat in a bush out of his dog's reach before he eagerly ripped open one of the boxes. It was full of pink balls, each the size of a marble. Henry popped one of them into his mouth, bit through the sugar coating, chewed vigorously, and then blew a rubbery pink bubble. It really was bubble gum. Henry opened several other boxes and found them full of gum too. He couldn't take the time to count the balls, but there must have been 200, maybe even 300, in each box. He counted the boxes. There were 49, all full of bubble gum. 49 times 300 was, well, it was a terribly big number. Henry couldn't believe it. 49 boxes of bubble gum and 300 balls in each box? It was enough to last the rest of his life. He would never have to park his gum again. He was rich. Then Henry began to think. He knew he was rich only if he could get the gum home without being seen by the other boys and girls. That was not going to be easy. He took the pound of ground round steak out of the bushes and picked up 2 boxes of gum. "Come on, Ribsy," he said, and ran home as fast as he could. Henry tossed the package of meat onto the drain board in the kitchen and stowed the gum under his bed in his own room. Then he ran down Clickitat Street toward Beezus's house. He was careful to slow down when he saw her in the yard. "Hi," said Henry, as if he had all the time in the world. "Hello, Henry," said Beezus, gathering a handful of tulip petals and tossing them into the air so that they fell over her in a pink shower. Her little sister Ramona was sitting on an apple box at the edge of the sidewalk. "Say, Beezus," said Henry casually, "could I borrow your red wagon for a little while?" "What for?" asked Beezus, looking much too interested. "Oh, just an errand," said Henry. "Can I go?" asked Beezus. "No," Henry hid his impatience. "It's just I've got some work to do." "Then you can't borrow it," said Beezus, and gathered another handful of petals. Henry saw that this was a situation that must be handled carefully. "I'll give you a piece of bubble gum." He blew a bubble for her to admire. "Okay," agreed Beezus. "Give it to me, and I'll get the wagon." Henry knew she had him there. He hadn't put any loose gum in his pockets. He should have known better than to ask a favor of a girl anyway. "I'll give it to you when I get back," he said. Beezus was firm. "Not unless I go too." Henry saw Scooter riding toward them on his bicycle and knew he had to act fast. He didn't want old Scooter hanging around asking questions. "Okay," he agreed quickly. "You can go, but just remember I've got double dibs on what I'm going to bring home." When Henry and Beezus returned from the backyard with the red wagon, Scooter was no longer in sight, but Ramona was still sitting on the apple box. "Come on, Ramona," said Beezus, taking an old panda bear out of the wagon. "We're going with Henry." "No," said Ramona. Henry was growing anxious. What if Scooter decided to cut through the vacant lot? "Jeepers, Beezus, we've got to hurry. It's awfully important. If we don't get where we're going, we might be too late." "Ramona," coaxed Beezus, "can't you play that game some other time?" "What game?" asked Henry. He couldn't see that Ramona was playing any game. "She's playing Waiting for the Bus," explained Beezus. Henry groaned. That was the dumbest game he had ever heard of. "Doesn't she know it isn't any fun just to sit on a box?" he asked, looking nervously up and down the street. If only he could be sure that no one else had discovered that gum. "Shh!" whispered Beezus. "She thinks it's fun, and I don't want her to find out it isn't. It keeps her quiet." Then she said to her little sister, "If you get in the wagon, Henry and I'll pull you, and you can pretend you're riding on the bus." Henry was relieved to see that this idea pleased Ramona, who climbed into the wagon. He and Beezus ran down the street, pulling the wagon behind them. When they came to the path through the vacant lot, Beezus pushed the wagon and Henry pulled. If only no one else had discovered Henry's treasure. "Gee willikers," said Beezus in a hushed voice when she saw what they had come for. "Are all those boxes really full of gum?" "They sure are," said Henry, gathering an armload. Beezus began to help. "And it's all yours?" "Well, sure, I found it, and I said I had double dibs, didn't I?" said Henry. "But just to be sure, I've got to get it home before the other kids see it." Beezus was a sensible girl who understood the importance of this, and she began to work faster. She lifted Ramona out of the wagon. Ramona yelled. "Here, chew this," said Beezus, poking a piece of gum into her mouth. When Beezus and Henry had all the gum loaded onto the wagon, Henry took off his jacket and spread it over the boxes. Then they pulled their cargo home as fast as Ramona could run. "Whew," breathed Henry when they turned into his yard. Now that the gum was on his property, no one could come along and say he had dibs on it too. He flung himself down on the front steps. "Come on," he said. "Let's chew." Beezus helped herself to a ball of gum and crunched through the sugar coating. Henry added a ball to the one he already had in his mouth. Ramona, too young to be an expert, smacked noisily. Henry gave Ribsy a piece. Looking puzzled, the dog tried to bite into it. The ball rolled around in his mouth until he spat it out on the grass and looked reproachfully at Henry. Then Robert came down the street. "What's up, Doc?" he asked. "Look!" Henry blew a bubble the size of a tennis ball. When it broke with a satisfying pop, he had difficulty getting the gum back into his mouth because it stuck to his chin. "Have a piece." "Or two," he said when he was able to talk. "Wow!" Robert stared at the wagon load of gum. He lost no time in putting two pieces into his mouth. The group chewed busily until Mary Jane appeared. "Henry Huggins, where'd you get that gum?" she demanded. "Have a piece." Henry ignored her question as he extended a box of gum to her. "No, thank you," said Mary Jane. "My mother says chewing gum is vulgar." She watched the others chew until she could stand it no longer. "If you don't mind," she said, "I think I will try just one piece." Henry pulled a bubble back into his mouth. "Sure, help yourself." The first time Mary Jane tried to blow a bubble, she blew the gum out of her mouth and onto the grass. "No, that's not the way," said Henry, offering her another piece. "Flatten it with your teeth and then poke your tongue into it before you blow." After a little practice, Mary Jane blew small, ladylike bubbles. Then Scooter came pedaling down the street on his bicycle. He stopped when he saw the group on the steps. "Say, Huggins, when are you going to get that bike?" Henry blew an extra large bubble before he answered. "You just wait and see." Scooter whistled with amazement. "Say, where'd you get all that?" "None of your beeswax," said Henry through his wad. "How about letting me have a piece?" asked Scooter. "No," said Henry. "Aw, come on," coaxed Scooter. "Nope." Henry was pleased that he had something Scooter wanted. Scooter thought a minute. "I'll let you ride my bike to the corner and back if you'll give me a piece." This put a new light on the matter. "Let me ride around the block," barked Henry. "Okay." Scooter got off his bicycle. "Just one piece. Robert, you watch my gum while I'm gone." Henry picked up the bicycle. He wished he weren't so wobbly at riding, because he knew he would never hear the last of it if he took a spill in front of Scooter. He stepped on the high pedal with his left foot, threw his right leg across the seat, and found the other pedal with his right foot. The bike was too large for him, and he teetered from one side of the walk to the other before he got started. Then Henry began to enjoy himself. This was the life. And if Scooter let him ride around the block for one piece of gum, there was no telling what he could get with the rest. Henry started to make plans. He would use the gum the way the Indians use wampum. He would take some to school and see what the other boys and girls offered him. Why, they would probably even give him money for the gum. If he sold it for less than the store did, say 2 balls for a penny, he would get rid of it in no time and have the money for his bike fund. He'd show old Scooter yet. The ride around the block was much too short. When he laid the bike on the lawn, Beezus said, "Henry, I need my wagon. I've got to take Ramona home. She's got gum in her hair." "Sure," said Henry. "Oh, and here's a box of gum for letting me use the wagon." "A whole box?" exclaimed Beezus gratefully. "Gee, thanks, Henry. I never expected this much." As Beezus and her little sister left, Mr. Huggins pulled into the driveway and got out of his car. "Hey, kids," he said. "What's all this?" When Henry explained, his father laughed and quickly estimated the total amount of gum. 49 boxes of 300 balls each is, let's see, 14,700 balls of gum. Quite a lot, isn't it? Even Scooter looked impressed until Mr. Huggins said, "How do you know there isn't something wrong with it?" 4 wads of gum were promptly spat into the shrubbery. Henry discovered that his jaws were very tired. Come to think, there was something funny about all that gum lying around in the vacant lot. "Or maybe it's stolen goods," suggested Mr. Huggins. "There must be some reason why it was dumped in the lot." "Receiving stolen goods is pretty bad, isn't it?" asked Scooter. "Aw, keep quiet," said Henry. "Well, gee, Dad, what do you think I'd better do?" "Suppose I phone the police and ask them about it," suggested Mr. Huggins. "Okay." Henry knew it was the right thing to do, but he didn't see how he could give up all that valuable gum. Not after his idea for building up his bike fund. And besides, it would really be something to show the kids at school. After Mr. Huggins talked to the police, who said that they would let him know what they found out about the gum, Henry spent an anxious evening. He stacked the boxes neatly under his bed just in case he could keep them. Then he found he didn't feel much like reading or working on his model plane, so he wandered around the house, drumming his fingers on the window panes and waiting. Finally, Mrs. Huggins put down her knitting and said, "Henry, for heaven's sake, can't you light some place?" Henry flung himself into a chair. "Gee, Mom, do you think they'll phone or drive up in a squad car?" As if in answer to his question, the telephone rang. Henry held his breath while his father answered. "Yes," said Mr. Huggins. "Yes, I see. It is? Oh, yes. Thank you for letting us know." "What did they say, Dad? What did they say?" demanded Henry. "The gum was thrown away by a man who owned a lot of gum machines and is going out of business," answered Mr. Huggins. "So I get to keep it then, don't I, Dad?" Mr. Huggins smiled. "The police say there's no reason why you shouldn't keep it." "I was afraid of that," sighed Mrs. Huggins. "Henry, how do you keep getting mixed up in these things?" "Boy, oh boy," Henry gloated. "Wait till I tell the kids at school." The next morning Mrs. Huggins didn't have to tell Henry to hurry. He and Ribsy left for school 15 minutes early. On the way, Henry chewed a couple of balls out of the box he was carrying so he could show off some really good bubbles. As soon as he reached Glenwood School, boys and girls began to crowd around him. "Did you get to keep all that gum Mary Jane said you found in the lot?" they asked. "Sure I got to keep it," said Henry, disappointed at having his surprise spoiled. "If that wasn't just like a girl, especially Mary Jane. I'm going to sell it 2 for a penny." The boys and girls knew a bargain when they saw one. "I'll take 4," said Joey. "Give me 2," said Peter. Some of the children did not have money with them, but Henry said they could bring it the next day. He opened charge accounts by writing their names and the amounts they owed on the margin of a comic book he had in the hip pocket of his jeans. By the time the second bell rang, Henry had 22 cents coming to him. "Boy, oh boy," he thought, "this is even better than I expected." By noon, the news of Henry's treasure had spread throughout the school, and boys and girls from other rooms crowded around to buy the bargain gum. Henry was so busy selling that Beezus offered to write down the names of those who were going to bring their money the next day. By the time school was out, Henry had 51 cents in real money and 43 cents written in his comic book. That was almost $1 for his bike fund. Besides that, he had 4 marbles, a yo-yo, and 6 comic books. And that was not all. Joey chose him to be the next blackboard monitor. Kathleen said she was going to invite him to her birthday party. 6 boys wanted to sit beside him in the cafeteria at noon, and Roger rode him home on his bicycle. The next day Henry left even earlier and took another box of gum to school. He found business more complicated because he not only had to sell gum and write down the names of the boys and girls who would bring their money the next day, he had to cross off in his comic book the names of those who had remembered to bring the pennies they owed him. He was glad when Beezus arrived and helped him keep the transaction straight. At first, the boys and girls who were chewing Henry's gum were careful to chew only when Miss Bonner wasn't looking, but after a while they forgot. Then she said unexpectedly, "Henry, tell the class what mark of punctuation should go at the end of the sentence I have written on the blackboard." Taken by surprise, Henry quickly shifted his quid of gum to his cheek. "A period, I mean a question mark," he said. "I think, Henry," said Miss Bonner, "that if you throw your gum in the wastebasket we shall all have much less trouble understanding you." Feeling foolish, Henry walked to the front of the room and threw his wad of gum into the empty metal wastebasket. When it landed with a loud clunk, the whole class tittered. "And now," said Miss Bonner, "I want everyone in the room who has gum in his or her mouth to throw it into the wastebasket." Sheepishly, half a dozen boys and Beezus walked to the wastebasket and discarded their gum. Miss Bonner looked around the room. "Robert," she said sternly. "George." The 2 boys slouched to the wastebasket. After recess, Miss Bonner marched another procession of gum chewers to the wastebasket. Although she didn't say much, Henry decided she looked pretty cross. When Henry carried his gum out to the playground at noon, he found to his surprise that no one wanted to buy. "Maybe if you cut the price, you could sell more," suggested Beezus. "I guess I'll have to," said Henry. "I'll try 4 for a penny." Business picked up after that, but when Henry went home after school he wasn't sure how much money he had. He actually had 31 cents in his pocket, but when he tried to figure out the accounts in the comic book he had to give up. Some of the boys who had forgotten to bring their money had charged more gum. Some had paid, but he had forgotten to cross off their names. Anyway, the comic book was getting so ragged and dirty and the pencil marks so smudged that it was impossible to read anything. Tossing the book into the fireplace, Henry decided he could remember how much Roger and Peter and a few more owed. He would just have to hope the others paid him. The next morning when Henry was about to start to school with a box of gum, Beezus rang the doorbell. She handed Henry her box of bubble gum. "Mother says I have to give this back to you," she said. "What for?" asked Henry. "Because of Ramona. She gets into the gum and chews it and gets it stuck in her hair. The only way Mother can get it out is to cut it out with the scissors. Ramona looks pretty awful with her hair all different lengths, and Daddy says if this keeps up she'll be bald before long." Beezus looked apologetic. Anyway, I'm kind of tired of chewing gum. When they reached the playground, Henry found business slow. Everyone was already chewing gum, but when Henry cut the price to 10 balls for a penny, he made several sales. Do you have any flavors besides cinnamon, peppermint, or whatever it is? Asked Joey. Henry had to admit he did not. Oh, said Joey, and went away. Henry tried to think what stores did when they wanted to sell something. He knew they had sales, they advertised, and they gave away free samples. Henry had tried gum sales, and he couldn't think of a good way to advertise, so he decided to try free samples. Although a dozen children crowded around him for samples, the demand was not as large as he expected. Then Roger, who owed Henry 4 cents for gum, approached him and asked for a free sample. Henry wasn't sure whether he should give gum to someone who owed him money, but since he had given it to the others, he gave Roger a piece. Roger put it into his pocket. "How about that 4 cents you owe me for 8 balls of gum you bought yesterday?" asked Henry. "I forgot it," said Roger. "And anyway, how come you're giving gum away today when you sold it yesterday?" "Well," Henry didn't like to admit that no one was interested. "Yes," said Peter, joining in the conversation. "I don't see why I have to pay you. You're giving it away now." "I wasn't giving it away yesterday and the day before," said Henry. "I was selling it, so you owe me money." "I do not." Peter blew a bubble that popped. "You do too," said Henry, feeling confused. The bell rang and they started toward their classroom. Henry noticed Peter and Roger talking to each other. Then they gathered a bunch of children around them outside the door. They talked earnestly together until Miss Bonner herded them into the room. Now what are they up to? Thought Henry. He worried about it all through social studies and arithmetic. Somehow things didn't seem to be turning out the way he had planned. He was secretly pleased when Miss Bonner made Peter throw his gum into the wastebasket. When recess came, Henry was surprised at the number of boys and girls who suddenly wanted free gum. He had almost as big a crowd around him as he had had on the first morning. He began to enjoy himself again. Then Roger and Peter called to him. "Hey, Henry, can we see you a sec?" "Sure," said Henry, stepping away from the others. "Here's the gum I owe you." Roger handed Henry 8 balls of bubble gum. "Mine too." Peter held out 4. "Hey, wait a minute," protested Henry. "This isn't fair." "It is too," said Roger. "We bought gum from you, and now we're returning it instead of paying for it." "You chewed it," objected Henry. "I saw you, and Miss Bonner made you throw it into the wastebasket." "This gum hasn't been chewed, has it?" asked Peter. Henry had to admit it hadn't. "Then why can't we return it, like in a department store?" demanded Roger. Baffled, Henry took the gum. Something was wrong someplace, but he couldn't figure it out. "Well, I know what is wrong, Henry. You suck at business." He did know one thing, that was sure. There went 6 cents out of his bike fund. Then Mary Jane ran up to Roger and Peter. "Did you take the free samples we collected for you?" she asked. "Well, how do you like that?" exclaimed Henry. "That's cheating, that's what it is." "It is not," said Mary Jane. "You gave us the gum, and if we want to give it to somebody else, that's our business." Henry looked glum. He supposed it was her business. Mary Jane was one of those annoying girls who were always right. The worst of it was, now he couldn't expect the others to pay. Henry was actually glad when the bell ended recess, even though he knew spelling came next. That day no one chose Henry to be a monitor, and only Robert sat with him in the cafeteria. He heard Kathleen say she thought she wouldn't invite any boys to her birthday party. After lunch, when the class was settled with its readers, the room door opened and Miss Mullen, the principal, entered. She whispered to Miss Bonner and then turned to the class. "Boys and girls," she announced, "I want to talk to you for a few minutes this afternoon. We have a problem at Glenwood School that we should all discuss." Now what? Thought Henry. Probably running in the halls again or writing on the buildings with chalk. Miss Mullen looked around the room. Then she said, "That problem is gum." Henry felt his neck and ears grow hot. He was sure everyone in the room was looking at him. Miss Mullen continued, "There has been more gum chewing than usual at Glenwood School in the last few days. I wonder if someone can tell me why it is not a good idea to chew gum in school." The class was silent. "Can't someone give me a reason?" she asked. "Henry Huggins, why do you think it is not a good idea?" Henry's ears felt as if they were on fire. He hadn't known Miss Mullen even knew his name. He said. Why couldn't you think of something to say? "Well," he had to think of something. It, well, I guess it is lots of trouble for teachers to make kids throw it in the wastebasket." The words came out in a rush. At least he had said something. "That is an excellent reason," said Miss Mullen. "Chewing gum wastes valuable time. Who else can give me a reason?" One of the girls timidly raised her hand and said, "Sometimes it gets stuck on the floor and things." "Splendid," said Miss Mullen. I was hoping someone would mention that, because our janitor tells me he spent most of his time in the last few days scraping gum off the floors and desks. The class began to feel less shy and was suddenly full of reasons why gum should not be chewed in school. Then Mary Jane raised her hand and said, "Miss Mullen, I know where the gum is coming from." Leave it to old tattletale Mary Jane, thought Henry, and after I showed her how to blow bubbles too. Miss Mullen said, "That isn't important, Mary Jane. What is most important is that so many boys and girls have been chewing gum in school." What a relief! At least Miss Mullen wasn't going to point him out in front of everybody. Miss Mullen smiled at the class. "Now that we have talked about our problem, I wonder how many boys and girls had decided not to chew gum in school anymore." 35 hands shot into the air. "Splendid!" exclaimed the principal. "I knew I could count on Miss Bonner's room to cooperate." When Miss Mullen left, Roger whispered across the aisle to Henry, "Now see what you've done." "Ah, keep quiet," answered Henry out of the corner of his mouth, as he bent over his reader. He knew one thing. Even though the class forgot his promise in a few days, he wouldn't be able to sell any gum around Glenwood for a long time. After school, he wasted no time in finding Mary Jane. "Tattletale!" he yelled. "Pooh to you," answered Mary Jane with her nose in the air. "Everybody's tired of your old gum anyway. It's all that funny cinnamon peppermint flavor." "Come on, Ribsy," said Henry to his dog, who had been waiting under the fir tree. He popped a ball of gum into his mouth, chewed, and blew a half-hearted bubble that broke with a little spip. He spat out the gum. Somehow, he didn't enjoy cinnamon peppermint flavor anymore. When Henry reached home, he threw his jacket and Daniel Boone cap onto a chair and went straight to the refrigerator. "Hi, Mom," he said to Mrs. Huggins, who was frosting a chocolate cake. "That sure looks good." "You may lick the bulb when I'm finished." Mrs. Huggins swirled the icing in a pattern on the cake. "And by the way, I want to talk to you." With a swipe of his finger, Henry wiped a drop of frosting from the edge of the bowl. It was peppermint flavored. "Henry, your hands aren't very clean," said his mother. "It's about those boxes of gum you have under your bed. How do you expect me to run the vacuum cleaner in your room? Why don't you give the gum to your friends? I'm sure they'll be glad to have it." Henry sighed. That was all his mother knew about his friends. Suddenly he found it made his jaws tired just to think about all those boxes and boxes of gum. He didn't want to think about it. Gum. Ugh. "Okay, Mom," he agreed. "I'll get rid of it. And don't bother saving the bowl for me to lick." Henry and Ribsy went out into the front porch. As Henry was wondering how he would get rid of the gum, Scooter rode by and called out, "Miss Mullen was sure on the warpath because of your old gum. She went to every room in the school. I bet you caught it." "I did not," said Henry. "And anyway, what do I care?" That's right, he thought. What do I care? He had saved over $1 for his bike fund, even if he couldn't expect to collect from the rest of the people who owed him money. Not only had he earned some bike money, he had been famous for a few days too, and for once in his life he had chewed all the gum he wanted. So had his friends. More than they wanted. It did not take Henry long to make up his mind. "Come on, Ribsy," he said, and ran down the street to Beezus' house. When Beezus and her little sister came to the door, Henry stared at Ramona. "Cheapers!" he exclaimed. "What happened to her?" Almost all the hair was cut off the left side of Ramona's head. The right side was jagged. "Doesn't she look awful?" asked Beezus. "She says she wants to be bald like her Uncle Jack." Henry groaned. Now probably everyone would say this was his fault. It certainly was funny the way he kept getting into trouble just because of a bunch of old gum. He would be glad when he saw the last of it. "Say, Beezus," he said, "could I borrow your red wagon again? I'm going to take that gum back to the lot and dump it where I found it." "Sure you can borrow it," answered Beezus. "Come on, I'll help."